What would you say if I told you there was a pediatric procedure performed back in the 90s that was comparable to violent rape? In fact, the patients of this procedure had so much in common with victims of child sexual abuse that these patients were often used as proxies in child sexual abuse studies. And the vast majority of children who went through this procedure described it as significantly more distressing and more painful than major procedures and major surgeries. Now, what would you say if I told you that this procedure is actually still being widely performed today? And not only that, but it is being promoted as safe, harmless, low risk, and painless. I cannot stress enough the wealth of evidence there is to disprove these claims. And unfortunately, these claims are on every single medical website in this country. VCUG patients were used as proxies in child sexual abuse studies as early as the 1990s. And yet, you will not find a single medical website that addresses that or even acknowledges it. In fact, the only risk that most, if not all, medical websites list is ionizing radiation. The irony being as well that the majority of these websites refer to the radiation as if it's not a big deal, when in reality, children's bodily tissues are tenfold more sensitive to this radiation. And the contrast agent used to fill the bladder has been linked to genitourinary cancers. Now, as a survivor, I cannot go into detail about the process and the steps involved in this procedure. To be completely honest, I'm not sure if I will ever be at a point in life where I can. I am triggered dozens of times a day. I'm 28 years old. I had this procedure done when I was 2. I repressed the memory. It was reduced to a nightmare, which I now know was a PTSD flashback that continued through high school. I grew up with this pervasive sense of defectiveness, like I was a freak and I was paranoid and clingy and dependent, and I just felt all sorts of wrong, and I never knew why. I've struggled with countless mental illnesses. I have attempted suicide. I have been sexually assaulted. I've been involved in domestic violence. I was extremely susceptible to abuse as a result of this procedure. It taught my 2-year-old body, naked on that table, that the best way to survive danger in stressful situations is to just freeze. And that's what I did, and that's what got me through that procedure. And my brain decided, you know what? We don't want to keep this memory. We will not survive with it. I did not learn about this again until last October. I was pregnant at the time. My bodily response was so great, and the resulting PTSD was so severe that I had a miscarriage a few weeks later. I lost both of my twins that my husband and I were very excited to bring home. We had names picked out. We had a shopping list on Amazon. You can imagine the trauma of that. Because my self-esteem had always been non-existent, I immediately just assumed that I was still a freak, that I was that one girl who just had a bad response to this thing, and I was an outlier, and I was doomed to be isolated forever, and now I knew that to be a fact. This was not the case, although it took me months to figure that out. My caregiver could not even recall the name of the procedure I'd had. I was told I'd had a transvaginal ultrasound, which floored me because that was how it felt in the PTSD nightmare I was having continuously throughout my childhood. It wasn't until a few days later that she finally got back to me with the name of the procedure. When I looked it up, I felt like there had to be some sort of mistake. The impact on my life was indescribable. And yet, all the websites I was poring over just made such light of this really dark topic for me, one that I've continued to relive in bodily sensations for the last 7 months. I've had PTSD since I was 2 years old, and I did not know it. And to make matters worse, none of my family knew it either. None of the adults around me knew it either. All the red flags of my PTSD were completely overlooked. I demonstrated many symptoms of child sexual abuse, and those were overlooked as well. This is the first time in my life, and I've been on this planet for 28 years, that I can look into a camera and say, I was wronged. I was failed by the adults around me who had an obligation to keep me safe. I was a child. And I relied on those adults for safety, security, and comfort, and survival. For several months after that, it was very hard to find any sort of will to live. This procedure not only devastated my mental health for 26 years, but it also completely devastated my physical health. When I finally got my hands on those medical records, there were over 200 pages of incidents, and I didn't remember a single one. The reason for that is because I was dissociating at every single appointment. One of the biggest effects of this procedure that no one is talking about is the avoidance of medical care. I have 2 autoimmune diseases. I have gladly chosen to live in excruciating pain with flare-ups and no pain management whatsoever. because that is less painful than me walking into a clinic. I have never been able to attend any sort of medical visit without having a panic attack before and after. The only reason I discovered this procedure was because I was having such a debilitating response to the idea of going to my first prenatal visit. I was terrified. The only thing that got me through was knowing that I had life in me to take care of, and I needed to do this. It's really crazy to think that I spent my entire life with this very intense aversion to medical care and medical professionals, and I never even understood why. Mind over matter is not a thing with trauma. You cannot make your nervous system just regulate. You can tell yourself everything you want, and that's what I tried to do. Every time I did have to go to the gynecologist for whatever reason, in times I couldn't avoid it, I would tell myself, every woman does this, this is a safe place. I'm getting care that I need. I am seeing a female doctor, which is the only type of doctor I will see, and it never worked. It never worked. I have not been able to emotionally regulate my body for my entire life. I don't know how to connect to my body. And that's really, really, really sad. And to think that this is happening to over 400,000 kids a year, and it's continued to be ignored, is not just angering, but it's extremely shocking. The very first time in my life I can remember not feeling crazy, not feeling wrong, not feeling a lot of self-doubt at every single thought was when I found a subreddit. It was created in 2021. It is the only thing on the internet that popped up when I typed in VCUG trauma. I'm sitting in front of this camera right now, today, because I found that group. That group was not only life-changing, but it saved my life. It was life-saving. I was extremely suicidal by the time I finally stumbled across this subreddit that I so desperately needed, full of other survivors. I cannot tell you how validating but also chilling it was to go read their stories. It was like reading my own life. I remember one survivor made a comment about how reading other people's stories felt like reading an old journal she had written before, but just forgot she'd written. And that is how it feels. Not only did finding that survivors group show me that I'm not alone and I'm not crazy and that my story has value and meaning, it also showed me that I was not even the worst off. Some of the survivors I've connected with have been through a hell I could not even imagine. I'm lucky to be alive right now, and I'm not sure if I would be had I gone through what some of these survivors have gone through. Many of them have had multiple, even several VCUGs done, and the only one I had was enough to completely derail my life. Another consistent theme that I have noticed in a lot of these stories is the prevalence of sexual abuse on part of doctors. Obviously, these adult survivors were very, very little. Preschool aged is the average, I believe, when they had this procedure done. However, most of them have very specific memories of certain actions and certain comments and certain phrases that were spoken to them during the procedure. One that I will never get out of my head is a male doctor who told a little girl, "Stop crying or I'll keep going." To this day, none of us can figure out what he meant by that. Many girls recall that their parents were not prepared. One girl even recounts both of her parents being locked out of the room without their knowledge. When they heard her screaming and crying in agony, they began crying and screaming and banging on the door to get in the room. The doctors did not let them in the room. The girl sat there and endured excruciating pain at the hands of masked male doctors, all while her parents screamed and banged on that door to get to her. No one came to save her. What does that do to a child in early development stages? What does that do? Can you possibly imagine? Because we can, and that's why we're here.